Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. The death sentences handed out by an Egyptian court against 529 supporters of the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood have sparked widespread outrage and international condemnation. As trials in Egypt become increasingly politicised, Analysis asks if the rule of law has broken down in the country. In the studio to discuss this with me are Peter Oborne, Chief Political Commentator at the Daily Telegraph, and Ian Least, QC. Karen Manara from the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights also joins us online. But before we begin the discussion, let's look at this report from Sarah Say.
This was the moment relatives heard yesterday's shock verdict. Death sentences handed out to 529 defendants who were accused of killing one policeman. It's the largest number of people to be sentenced to death by a court in Egyptian and modern world history. The defendants, many of those supporters of the deposed President Mohamed Morsi, were charged with attacking a police station in the Minya province of Upper Egypt and killing its deputy head. These attacks occurred during riots following the violent clear-out in August last year of the protest sit-in that called for the return of Mohamed Morsi, which led to the deaths of more than 900 people. Defence lawyers told Human Rights Watch that the trial took place in under an hour and that the prosecution did not put forward any evidence implicating individual defendants. The lawyers also reported that the court prevented defence lawyers from presenting their case or calling witnesses. Sarah Leah Whitson, the Middle East director of Human Rights Watch, stated that the Minya court failed to carry out its most fundamental duty to assess the individual guilt of each defendant, violating the most basic fair trial rights. These death sentences should be immediately quashed. The convicted are among more than 1,200 of Morsi's supporters who are on trial in Minya. The second group of 682 defendants, including the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Badi, have begun their trial today for charges including murder. Since the coup which ousted Mohamed Morsi last July, thousands of Brotherhood supporters have been arrested, while just one police officer is facing a prison sentence for the deaths of 37 detainees. Following the sentence, relatives and supporters of the defendants took to the streets in protest. But in Cairo, residents were divided over yesterday's court decision.
This is good because it is the first time that we see our judges act so quickly. So the best thing about it is that it happened quickly, from the time of the clearing out of the Rabba and Nada squares, when you have a big case decided so quickly. So we are very happy about this.
So why hasn't Mubarak been given the death penalty? Why hasn't Habib al-Adli been given the death penalty? So why haven't any of the ministers in jail been given the death penalty so far? Is their lawyer just really good and the lawyer for the 500 lousy? Or are the judges just different, each working according to different laws? This is a farce.
The court has now referred the verdict to the Grand Mufti, the government's official interpreter of Islamic law, for consultation on the verdict. The verdict can still be appealed. But there are concerns that these mass trials with such harsh sentencing could increase tensions and trigger more violence in Egypt and could end up backfiring on the military government's current popularity.
Karim, can I come to you first because you're out there in Cairo. What's been the reaction to this extraordinary sentence?
Well, obviously there's been outrage and there's a heavy debate that's been taking place since yesterday. There's a general sense of, I think a lot of people realise that it's very unlikely that these judgments will be executed simply because legal procedure was not followed. It was a sham of a trial, and it will go to cassation court, and hopefully we have faith that we'll be able to overturn it. That being said, this is there's a huge outcry, and there's a general, even if it's not going to be implemented, the idea that first instance courts have become so politicized that they give verdicts or decisions. It's not yet a final verdict, but are so obviously, so blatantly meant to intimidate and terrorize the opposition is incredibly scary. I mean, we haven't seen anything of that scale before in Egypt, and we've seen over the last 6 months, the polarization that's been taking place in Egypt has actually has affected everyone, including the judiciary. I mean, the judiciary has always maintained some degree of independence. Obviously, it's been partial, but not to that extent. And there's been an increasing and alarming trend of judges giving really harsh sentences without following proper procedure in a very short.
Okay, let me just stop you there, Karim, because I'll take up some of those points with the guests in the studio, and we'll try and improve that line with you if we can as well. Peter, I mean, even by we're used to extraordinary things coming out of the Egyptian revolution, but even by previous standards, this was a showstopper of a headline, wasn't it?
What it shows is that Egypt, under the military regime, is becoming a barbaric. It's it turned its back on the community of nations, which is a terrible thing. The judiciary is not an independent judiciary; it's actually an arm of the deep state. We've had the extrajudicial killing, the state murder of more than 1,000 people who are protesting, and now we're having the proposal to have judicial murder now. And so I would say and of course we've got a number of journalists in jail, trumped up charges. So you have to say to the people who now run Egypt that Egypt is a great country, a great history, but it has turned its back. It's become a pariah state with verdicts like this, and it's terrible that the people who are simply political activists are being sentenced to death.
I mean, Ian, we are moving into the territory of show trials here, aren't we?
Yes.
And directed actually at ordinary protesters, not at significant political figures either. It's not even a show trial of Morsi. It's a show trial of people who've just been protesting on the street.
It's hard to see a trial of 500 people in the context of normal understanding of judicial proceedings. So one asks the question, how can this be anything other than counterproductive if Egypt is pretending to present a civilized view of its society to the outside world? And as you've heard from your speaker, inevitably it's going to create unrest rather than settle a community one way or another to agree on the way forward. And I would have thought this, as I've said, is counterproductive in the overall scheme of things in Egypt. But clearly a view has been taken to implement a vice-like grip and policy over Egypt at this time by the ruling class.
Karim, let me ask you, where do you think this came from? I mean, it's clearly there's as we've all been saying, there's a politicised judiciary here. But do you think this kind of been a decision that was taken at the top and transmitted down, or is it a rogue element within the deep state that's doing this? Because it's hard to see how it's working even in their own terms. We've got possibility of General El-Sisi announcing his presidential candidature in the next few days. It's not really an opening gambit in that campaign, or is it?
Yeah. I mean, it's really difficult to try to make sense of the judgment and think of what the motivation might have been. It's difficult to rule out the possibility of interference from above, from the executive. But I personally, my guess is I don't think there was any interference I don't think it was a dictated decision. Courts tend to have a bit more independence than the prosecution, for instance. So during the prosecution phase, you get a lot of interference from the security apparatus, from the police. But I think a lot of people don't realize that the judiciary is we have some judges who are more pro-state than the state. Sometimes they deliver such sentences on their own initiative. I think also what we've the information that we have about this judge from lawyers in many and many ways is that he's quite not only is he famous for the brutality of the sentences, but we've been told that he had a son who was a police officer and who was killed in the riots in early 2011. And there might be a personal factor in this because he was a judge on the trial of police officers who were charged with killing demonstrations in 2011, and he acquitted all of them in a judgment that also, according to the lawyers who were involved in it, did not meet basic standards, legal procedural standards.
Okay, so, well, that's interesting, Peter. But just how do you read this in relationship to the sort of ongoing process of the coup? Obviously, it's directed at the Brotherhood, which are now outlawed, declared a terrorist organisation. But how do you see it in relationship to the coming presidential elections?
Well, the presidential elections are coming up, and we've got this very interesting decision of whether Field Marshal, as he now styles himself,
I demoted him randomly there.
Sisi is going to run, and I have to say that he would be. I know that although there would be honesty about it. Clearly, Field Marshal Sisi is running the country. There's a moment of danger too, because it's very important for I would have thought for the barbarians who now run Egypt, the army and the police and their creatures in the judiciary, to keep themselves, not make their power too overt. They really do need a civilian puppet in a way, because I think that Sisi will find it hard to come forward and justify this kind of barbarous. I mean, I do say the word advisedly barbarous, but Egypt is the cradle of civilization, and we are seeing a barbarous and grotesque behavior which recalls the worst kind of regime of the 20th century at the moment from Egypt. Anyway, so that is it is framing the coming elections in a horrible light.
I mean, Ian, it's quite an interesting question about the politicisation of the judiciary, because it's clearly politicised, but at the same time, what we're hearing from Cairo there is it's not politicised in the sense of a totalitarian regime that isn't coming right from the top. It's a kind of judiciary which is with the regime, positioning itself, but perhaps getting out ahead of the regime a little bit.
Well, there's clearly an incentive for any political organisation, be it a government or otherwise, to have some sense of legitimacy. And I presume the purpose of these trials is to add some legitimacy to the overall exercise of power. And as I said before, the problem with this type of judicial procedure is that it has a counterproductive effect in right-thinking members of, no doubt, of the society in Egypt and elsewhere around the world. So it's hard to see what the outcome is going to be. I listened carefully to your speaker saying that there inevitably will be appeals, that there's a long history of the death sentence not being implemented in Egypt. And so what essentially may occur is that these decisions taken against individuals as part of a block group that has been targeted for prosecution may end up simply being a reversal of the burden of proof, and that people who want to appeal have got to prove their innocence. I mean, it's hard to say without being close to the action, as it were, but that may well be how we see it work its way out, and the end of the process will be, no doubt, after the appeal procedures take place. But it's sending a very strict message out prior to the election, and no doubt that's an element of fear involved in seeking people to, bring them to heel.
Well, just like, Karim, is that working? How is it being received in Cairo? Is there outrage about this? Is there a popular disaffection about this decision, or is it doing what Ian's suggesting it's designed to do, and that is to cow people?
Well, I mean, obviously society is divided in Egypt, so if this really was what some people think it was just a populist decision that the judge delivered knowing that it will be overturned, which might be the case, then it was addressed to a certain constituency that wants the harsh, brutal judgments against the Brotherhood. But on the other side of that is clearly massive outrage, not just within the circles of the Muslim Brotherhood or Islam's opposition, but generally speaking, there's a big outcry against from what I can tell, at least, against the judgment and against the fact that it was so very clearly and visibly politicized and did not follow procedure. And even on the level of civil society, even if I agree with what the previous speaker said, that this whole thing about the reversal of the burden of proof is really alarming. I mean, even if judges deliver sentences knowing they will be overturned, this in itself is something that cannot be tolerated, and it's been tolerated in Egypt for a long time. The idea that political sentences are delivered in the first instance, and then whatever happens on appeal or in cassation will be the final judgment when it loses popular attention, which has been a judiciary trend, especially in the last 3 years.
So, Karim, are there divisions within the judiciary? Because, I mean, I remember, when Mubarak fell, I remember being in Tahrir Square and the judges would come in as part of the protest movement. So are there other sections of the judiciary which are hostile to this?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Are there other sections of the judiciary which are hostile to this decision? Because I remember very many judges being part of the opposition to the Mubarak regime.
Yeah, I mean, the judiciary is obviously not one monolithic block, and I've seen even some judges, judges that tend to be cautious and conservative with their commentary, political commentary. But I've seen some commentary today from some judges about how this is outrageous and it's an insult to the integrity of the judiciary. I wouldn't be able to. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the majority, but there is clearly a divide over this inside the judiciary institution itself.
OK, well, thanks. We're going to have to leave it there because that's the end of the first part of the programme. But we will be looking at some of the political ramifications of this decision on the future political developments in Egypt. So come back to us after the break.